Hey, beautiful souls, welcome back to Soul Stories. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to join our family. Stay with us, because a new love story is about to begin. The dust kicked up behind Clara's old pickup truck as she pulled into the gravel parking lot of the feed store. She sat there for a moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel, staring at nothing in particular. The radio played a country song she didn't recognize, something about lost love and open roads. She switched it off. 3 years. That's how long it had been since Thomas passed. 3 years of running the ranch alone, of mending fences and herding cattle and falling into bed each night too exhausted to dream. 3 years of forgetting what it felt like to be anything other than a widow, a worker, a woman surviving one day at a time. She caught her reflection in the rearview mirror and hardly recognized herself. Her dark hair, once her pride, was pulled back in a practical ponytail, streaked with gray she hadn't bothered to hide. The lines around her eyes told stories of squinting into too many sunsets, and her hands, when she looked down at them, were rough and calloused. Farmer's hands. Survivor's hands. Clara stepped out of the truck and walked into the feed store, nodding at old Mr. Patterson behind the counter. She moved through the aisles with the efficiency of someone who had made this trip 100 times before, grabbing the supplies she needed without thinking. That's when she heard the voice. "Excuse me, ma'am, you dropped this." She turned to find a man holding out her worn leather glove. He was tall, with broad shoulders and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. His eyes were a startling blue, like the sky just before a summer storm, and there was something gentle in the way he smiled at her. "Thank you," Clara said, taking the glove. Their fingers brushed briefly, and she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a small flutter in her chest like a bird trying to remember how to fly. "I'm Jake," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "Just moved to the area. Bought the old Morrison place about 5 miles east of here." Clara knew the property. It had been abandoned for years, the house falling into disrepair, the fields overgrown with weeds and wildflowers. "That place needs a lot of work," she said, not unkindly. "That it does," Jake agreed, "but I've got time and patience. Sometimes the things that need the most work turn out to be the most rewarding." There was something in his eyes when he said it. Something that made Clara feel like he was talking about more than just the old farmhouse. She found herself looking away, uncomfortable with the attention. "Well, good luck to you," she said, turning back to her shopping. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Over the following weeks, Clara kept running into Jake. At the feed store, at the diner in town, at the weekly farmer's market where she sold her eggs and vegetables. Each time, he would tip his hat and smile. And each time, that flutter in her chest grew a little stronger. She fought against it. She told herself she was too old for such foolishness, too tired, too broken. Thomas had been her great love, and she had accepted that she would spend the rest of her days alone with his memory. But Jake was persistent in the gentlest way possible. He never pushed, never demanded. He simply showed up, again and again, with that patient smile and those storm-blue eyes. One evening in late September, Clara was struggling to fix a broken fence post when she heard a truck coming up her driveway. She stood up, wiping her hands on her jeans, and watched as Jake's familiar pickup pulled to a stop. "Heard you might need some help," he said, stepping out with a toolbox in hand. "Who told you that?" Clara asked, though she wasn't really surprised. Small towns had no secrets. "Does it matter?" Jake walked over and surveyed the broken fence. "Mind if I lend a hand?" Clara wanted to say no. She wanted to tell him that she had been handling things on her own for 3 years and didn't need anyone's help. But the truth was, she was tired. So tired of carrying everything alone. "I suppose not," she said quietly. They worked together in comfortable silence as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. When the fence was fixed, Clara invited Jake inside for a cup of coffee. It was the first time she had invited anyone into her home since Thomas died. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she and Thomas had shared thousands of meals, and talked. Jake told her about his life before moving here, a divorce, a failed business, years of drifting from place to place, looking for somewhere that felt like home. Clara found herself sharing things she hadn't told anyone, the depth of her loneliness, the guilt she felt for still being alive when Thomas was gone. "I haven't felt like a woman in ages," she whispered, surprised by her own confession. "I feel like I'm just going through the motions, like I'm slowly disappearing." Jake set down his coffee cup and looked at her with those gentle eyes. "Then let's start slow," he said. "No pressure, no expectations. Just two people who maybe need a friend." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. She had expected judgment or pity, but Jake offered neither. He simply offered himself, patient and steady as the earth. Over the following months, Jake became a fixture in Clara's life. He would come by in the mornings to help with chores, and they would share lunch on the porch, watching the horses graze in the pasture. In the evenings, he would often stay for dinner, and they would sit by the fire and talk until the stars came out. He never rushed her. When she pulled away, he gave her space. When she reached out, he was there. He seemed to understand that healing was not a straight line, that some days Clara felt almost happy, and other days she could barely get out of bed. One afternoon in early spring, they were walking through the fields behind Clara's house when she stopped suddenly. The wildflowers were blooming, a carpet of purple and yellow stretching as far as the eye could see. Thomas had loved this time of year. They had walked through these same fields together, hand in hand, talking about the future they thought they had. "I feel guilty," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like I'm betraying him by being happy." Jake stood beside her, close but not touching. "Do you think he would want you to be unhappy for the rest of your life?" Clara thought about Thomas, about his laugh, about the way he always put everyone else before himself. She thought about what he would say if he could see her now, standing in their fields with another man. "No," she admitted, "he would want me to live." "Then live," Jake said simply. That night, for the first time in 3 years, Clara let someone hold her. They sat on the porch swing, wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars wheel overhead. Jake's arm was warm around her shoulders, and Clara let herself lean into him, let herself feel the comfort of another human being. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I know," he said. "Me too. What if I can't do this? What if I'm too broken?" Jake was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft but steady. "Clara, I've spent most of my life running from things, from responsibility, from commitment, from my own failures. When I bought that old farmhouse, I told myself it was just another place to land for a while. But then I met you." He turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. "You showed me what real strength looked. Not the kind of strength that means you never need help, but the kind that means you keep going even when everything in you wants to give up. You're not broken. You're the strongest person I know." Clara felt something shift inside her, like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for years. She reached up and touched Jake's face, feeling the roughness of his stubble beneath her fingers. "Start slow," she said, echoing his words from months ago. "Promise me we'll start slow." "I promise," he said, and he kept his promise. They took things one day at a time, building something new on the foundation of their shared wounds. Jake officially moved into the Morrison place and spent his days restoring it to its former glory. But his evenings belonged to Clara. They would cook dinner together, take walks in the fields, sit on the porch, and talk about everything and nothing. Clara found herself laughing again, really laughing. The kind that came from somewhere deep inside. She started paying attention to herself again, not just to the ranch and the animals and the endless list of chores. She let her hair down, literally and figuratively. She bought a new dress for the first time in years, something soft and feminine that made her feel like herself again. The townspeople noticed the change. At the diner, the waitress commented on how well Clara looked. At the farmer's market, old friends said there was a light in her eyes that had been missing for too long. Clara just smiled and said she was finally healing. But healing, she discovered, was not about forgetting. It was about making room for the grief and the joy, for the past and the future, for the memory of what was and the hope for what could be. 1 year after that first meeting in the feed store, Jake took Clara out to the old oak tree at the edge of her property. Thomas had carved their initials into that tree 40 years ago, when they were young and in love, and the future seemed infinite. Clara traced the faded letters with her finger, tears streaming down her face. But they were not only tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude for the life she had lived, for the love she had known, for the strength she had found to keep living. Jake stood beside her, patient as always, letting her take the time she needed. "I loved him," Clara said. "I will always love him." "I know," Jake replied. "And that's okay. The heart is big enough to hold more than one love." Clara turned to face him, this cowboy who had wandered into her life and shown her that it was possible to start over. "I feel like a woman again," she said, and for the first time in ages she meant it. Jake smiled and took her hand. "Then let's keep going." One day at a time, they walked back to the house together as the sun set behind them, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Clara didn't know what the future held. None of us ever do, but she knew that she was no longer just surviving. She was living again, truly living, and that was enough. In the kitchen, she put on some music and started making dinner. Jake came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, swaying gently to the melody. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Clara leaned back into his embrace and smiled. "I'm thinking about how life surprises you. How just when you think you know how the story ends, it takes a turn you never expected. And is this a good turn?" She turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to touch his weathered face, those storm blue eyes that had become so dear to her. "The best kind," she said. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the twilight sky. The horses were settling in for the night, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. The world kept tea, earning as it always did, indifferent to the small miracles happening in kitchens and on porches, in the hearts of people brave enough to start again. Clara had learned that starting slow didn't mean standing still. It meant moving forward at your own pace, honoring where you had been while making room for where you were going. It meant letting someone in, even when every instinct screamed to keep the walls up. It meant choosing hope over fear, love over loneliness, life over mere existence. And in that small farmhouse on the edge of town, surrounded by fields of wildflowers and memories and possibility, a woman who had forgotten herself found her way back, not to who she had been, but to who she could become.